Greetings YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican, and I've returned once again to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Today, we're going to be doing a movie analysis of Aquaman. I just saw this movie a couple of nights ago, and the more I reflect upon what I saw, I realize that I witnessed one of, if not the greatest conservative movies ever made. Yes, Aquaman, this year, is on par with Death Wish and Ghostbusters. So, let me explain why Aquaman is a conservative masterpiece. In America, Democrats and Republicans compete for everything, and this political conflict also applies to comic books and superhero movies. Marvel has fully embraced the Democratic agenda. If you watch Marvel films, you're basically watching left-wing propaganda. However, DC has taken up the opposite side, and they are the advocates of conservative Republican thought. And I believe that they've actually done a fantastic job of conveying their message very clearly and eloquently, whereas Marvel, despite being clearly leftist, can be a little muddled in the way that they go about it. But we're not here to talk about Marvel. Let's look at a few other DC movies and see how they also advance a clear conservative agenda. In Dark Knight Rises, the last of the Christopher Nolan trilogy, Batman is there to uphold law and order against the masses, and he also fights a villain who is essentially the living embodiment of Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street is represented through Bane as a threat to basic decency and Western civilization itself. Fast forward a bit, Wonder Woman from a couple of years ago. What this movie does is twofold. On the one hand, Wonder Woman is an Amazon, and the Amazons were a myth, and by upholding the basic truth of myth, what DC is doing is upholding tradition. They understand something that liberals do not, and that is that all myths are based in reality. Now, a myth isn't necessarily 100% true, but there's always a very strong element of truth. Hardly any myth is less than 75% true. They also, in Wonder Woman, promote love of country and service to one's country. Wonder Woman comes out and joins the United States war effort to defeat Germany during World War I. This war was just as important as World War II, and she defeated Ares, who had decided to become a Nazi and join with the Germans. In 2018, late 2018, Aquaman joined this proud tradition, and I strongly recommend that you all go see it in theaters right now. Possibly go back again if you haven't seen it before, and remember what I have said in this video when you do. Anyway, what we see is that Aquaman continues this proud tradition, but really perfects the formula of making a perfect Republican movie. So, let's get into the specifics now that we've set this up. Most past versions of Aquaman have had Aquaman be such a beta male that I've often wondered if he wasn't a closeted homosexual. However, this version of Aquaman is a man's man. And I think that this tradition goes back to the recent film Batman vs. Superman, a highly underrated superhero movie. Batman vs. Superman is effectively not only a conflict between two men, but a conflict over their masculinity. Batman was trying to prove that even though Superman was endowed with special powers, that he was more of a man than Superman and therefore could beat him. And so it was a contest of masculinity and talking about how men have to be men, but not necessarily be overly aggressive. So it's about containing your manhood. That's really what Batman vs. Superman was about. It's about the struggle to really be a man and to use your testosterone wisely. Aquaman is also a story of men being men and fighting with other men to prove their supremacy. This movie is a clear response to and rejection of radical feminism. Every frame is informed by this. If I had to take a wild guess, I would say that whoever wrote this script and all of the editors are people who frequently watch Jordan Peterson's lectures or else have read his books. Since many of the people in this film have the powers of the Atlanteans, the power to swim really fast and talk to fish and whatnot, I think you could actually make a very compelling case that the thing that sets Aquaman apart is his masculinity. His alpha male status is what enables him to stand out from among the crowd and really defeat people who are as well positioned or better, especially when we talk about his conflict with his brother King Orm. Another thing to keep in mind is that we see several different Atlantean kings in this film, but we can see which kings are good and bad based on which of them are real men. If you are a real man and you're a real king, there's no difference between the two things, really. If you want to be effective as a king, you have to be a great man. To be a great man, you have to be willing to fight. The kings who fought and believed in what they fought for were successful and great, and the kings who did not were not worthy of their office, and they found themselves killed or forced to be subordinates to King Orm. So this movie gets it exactly right. That's how real life works. For instance, the reason why Donald Trump won the presidency and also won the primary is because he was the alpha male in the field. Ted Cruz was actually more qualified to be president, if we're being completely honest, but he is not as much of a man as Donald Trump is. Donald Trump sunned him, or I guess to put it less charitably, he made him his bitch. Anyway, so Aquaman not only promotes a conservative understanding of the world, promotes masculinity, but also promotes an extremely realistic portrayal of human reality. So one of the things that we're first introduced to in Aquaman is the myth of Atlantis. And one of the most important aspects of the myth of Atlantis is that it is a historical fact. It is recorded by the Romans. They didn't just make things up in their histories. They understood the genre of history demands that you tell the truth. The only people who reject the historical reality of Atlantis are left-wing postmodernist academics. And the only reason they do that is to demean the West and its accomplishments. However, Atlantis is a part of the Western tradition, and it needs to be honored just as we honor Rome and Britain and other countries that composed our Western tradition. This movie implicitly argues for the Western tradition by showing how advanced Atlantis was, and it also argues for conservative values by its portrayal of Atlantis' values, which you'll notice are extremely conservative. Conservative to the point where they are to the right of today's Republican Party, and in exactly the right ways, as we'll see. Aquaman also upholds the Western tradition and real history by naming Aquaman after one of the greatest kings in the history of Western civilization, King Arthur of Britain. Aquaman's parents named him this, knowing that there would be a parallel between him, a boy born of an Atlantean queen, and King Arthur, the man who saved Britain. This obviously acknowledges the fact that Arthur is real. Otherwise, why would, once they've acknowledged Atlantis, would the Atlanteans acknowledge Arthur? We've established that they're both real because they both acknowledge one another. This is, in addition, a further affirmation of Anglo-Saxon culture, history, and tradition. Needn't say more. It's all pretty obvious unless you are completely dense. The movie's main focus is on Aquaman and his mother. However, his father is one of the unsung conservative heroes of the movie. Arthur's father raised him to know and value history and love his country. Aquaman is a good son who honors his parents, both of them, not just the one who is of royal blood. In fact, he was living with his dad and supporting him in many ways. He helped his dad when his dad got drunk, and he did other things for his father as well. In Sicily, when Arthur was there looking for a relic, he reveals that his father taught him Western history. He knew all about the history of Rome, for instance. And one of the ways the movie tries to draw our attention to the fact that the father is actually very important, despite the fact that he was not a high-ranking individual, is that they cast the same person who played Jango Fett in the prequels. Now, the prequels, of course, are some of the greatest movies ever made, and Jango was a fantastic father to his son Boba Fett, who went on to succeed him and become the greatest bounty hunter in the galaxy. So for Arthur, he was lucky to have a father like his father in the movie, just like Boba Fett was very lucky to have Jango as a father. Also, Jango was a sort of king in the sense that his DNA was used to clone an entire army, and just by virtue of being genetically related to that many people, Jango was a kind of king in the Star Wars universe, if you really think about it. So this is a way to make Aquaman's father far more important without having to show him on the screen and take away from all of the really important things that you need to do to establish the universe of Aquaman. So brilliant cinematography and brilliant writing in this movie. It really just sets all this up perfectly and gives you everything you need to know while not dwelling on any particular thing. Many movies that advocate a conservative worldview do so apologetically and somewhat cautiously. However, Aquaman is bold in its conservatism, and it very much does promote the idea of the divine right of kings, a correct, if often ignored, doctrine. And before anyone accuses me of being a monarchist, let me just tell you that all of the kings who are worthy to rule have all died out, their bloodlines are gone, so I am not advocating a return to monarchy. Once a divine bloodline is lost, it cannot be retrieved. However, if a divine bloodline dating back to Christ or one of the prophets from the Bible could be found, then we should definitely adhere to their rules since they were anointed by God. But this is not quite the place to go into that. We're trying to avoid contemporary politics and just talk philosophy and Aquaman, so let's get back on track. In the movie, Aquaman is special and powerful because he is the son of a queen and he has royal blood. And this royal blood enables him to do things that other people simply cannot. He is better than other people, just like kings are better than their subjects. It's just a fact, not an opinion. Look throughout history. How many subjects of Gilgamesh were greater than Gilgamesh? 0. How many were equal to Gilgamesh at anything? 0. Queen Atlanta is dressed up and acts as a queen in every single scene. She never tries to hide her identity, and she is never ashamed of her royal dignity. If we compare her to even Padme/Queen Amidala from episode 1, what we see is that Padme often tried to hide her identity a little bit because she didn't want anyone to know that she was queen. She would be willing to cast aside her royal identity for short periods of time. Queen Atlanta, however, is very proud of the fact that she's a royal, and she advertises openly to people, yes, I am a queen, and yes, I am better than you. If you don't like it, we'll fight, and I'll kick your ass with my trident. And I really appreciate her candor and her upholding of natural order and hierarchy. Atlanta is brave, bold, selfish, and valorous. In other words, she would be a true king if only she had a penis. And she is far from being just an empty vessel. Now, many women are simply the transmitters of genetic material. And you don't have to be very special to be a royal woman. However, when you have a royal woman who is special, that means that her son will be incredible. Alexander the Great, his mother was someone who was an incredible human. And that's why Alexander was able to conquer all of the barbarians. To build on my previous point, the movie is very clear that people of royal blood are inherently superior to people without it. Only Atlanteans who have royal blood are able to breathe on land and in water. This is a code of sorts for a historical reality where if we look at kings who are legitimate and are of the proper breeding, they know how to govern in a mundane day-to-day sense. They know how to run their kingdoms well, how to expand, all that, and they also understand how to establish moral standards. Only true kings set up laws that last and guide their people to prosperity. In this movie, we see 0 instances of a no-name loser taking down a royal or an aristocrat. And this means that the movie not only recognizes hierarchy in theory, but it also shows it in practice. Any of these commandos who are sent out against Aquaman are simply cannon fodder. They have no chance. They are inferior fighters. They do not have royal blood. They have no chance. And again, like I mentioned Alexander earlier, he was a great ruler. Not only did he know how to run an empire, but he was a far better general than anything that the Assyrians could throw at him, and that is why he conquered them. So this is something that is also rooted in a deep understanding of history. One thing that I really admire about Aquaman is how tightly it's written. The movie correctly identifies royal superiority and then adheres to this principle without any exceptions or deviations. It is remarkable. The only characters in the movie who are able to effect change are royals: Arthur, Orm, Mira, Atlanta. These are the 4 royal characters we meet in the film, and they are the only people who could reasonably be considered either protagonist or antagonist in any meaningful sense. Yes, there is the one black pirate guy, but he is just Orm's guy. He is a hired thug. The end. The only characters who have knowledge or wisdom in this film are either royals, like the aforementioned Big Four, or nobles like Volko. Romulus is the only Roman who mattered according to Aquaman because he was a king. And he was the person whose statue was used to indicate the location of a sacred relic for that reason. So once again, we see all of this coming together. Aquaman valued tradition. Tradition says that only kings matter. The Romans would have told you that Romulus was greater than the various generals and other people assembled around him in that circle of statues. And again, Alexander was not the only Greek general to ever exist. However, he was the only person who could have defeated so many Orientals when he invaded the Assyrian Empire. And he's the only person who could have conquered it entirely in the way that he did over the course of like 3 or 4 years. So this is something that Aquaman drives, and it's also something that is historically completely correct. So all the credit in the world to the writers of Aquaman for having the balls to point out the truth in a world that is increasingly left-wing and delusional. Earlier I said that I wasn't going to talk about Marvel, and I'm going to have to break that promise. So Marvel is a company which does not value tradition in any way, and it promotes the commie and queer agenda every chance that it gets. The one thing that Marvel did that was truly great was to invent the character of Captain America during World War II. Captain America is such an obviously great character that DC has actually paid Marvel to have Captain America make appearances in some of their films. So, when Marvel is right, they're right. Once in a while, they'll get something correct, just by accident, or something that happened before Stan Lee and his communism took over and ruined the company. Anyway, one thing you'll notice about Marvel is that their new direction is a lot less like Captain America and a lot more like Deadpool. Deadpool is someone who has no respect for tradition, and he also is willing to make a joke of anything. Nothing is sacred to Deadpool, and that is why he is a complete blight on the superhero scene. He makes light of things that are very serious and very important. However, Aquaman is the exact opposite of Deadpool. Aquaman, both as a movie and as a character, always respects tradition and never mocks that which is sacred. The title of Ocean Master is introduced, and this is basically the high kingship of the seas. This is a very serious thing. Being a king is something which deserves a great deal of reverence. Being the Ocean Master is an even higher honor. It would be like comparing a local king of, say, Switzerland to an emperor like the Roman emperor. There's no real comparison. One is very exalted, and the other one is far more exalted. When he wants to fight his brother Orm, King Arthur knows that he will need to claim the title of king in order to be taken seriously. If he's just Arthur, the illegitimate son of an ex-queen, then he is a nobody. However, if he is the king, people will respect him because they know that kings are favored by the heavens. Kings are special in ways that other people simply are not. Royal blood is great, but if both you and another person have it, it doesn't give you an advantage. The title of king, however, does give you that advantage. And after he fails in his initial bid to seize the throne, Arthur then has to go on a trip to find some relics and really fully claim his Atlantean heritage. So basically the reason why he wasn't able to claim it in the first place is because he was not in tune enough with Atlantis, since he had been living too long on the surface. Even though he was more of a man than his brother Orm, he still needed to be more attuned to his tradition and his values and the ways of his people in order to truly be their king. To truly be their king, you have to fully represent them. One person in our time who did a fantastic job of honoring our traditions and keeping us afloat during a time of crisis was George W. Bush. He always stood at attention for the Pledge of Allegiance. He always placed his hand on his heart, and he was respectful of our traditions in every conceivable way. So in many ways, Aquaman is the movie equivalent to George W. Bush in the sense of really respecting tradition and not mocking that which should never be mocked. According to a lot of Marxist, left-wing, postmodernist, revisionist histories, we shouldn't view history as just a bunch of great men going around changing things. History is the history of groups, and all these marginalized people like women and minorities did things that were significant. Well, that's bullshit. Look, women were present when great things were done, but they were simply in the background washing clothes, or they were working their shift at the brothel. They weren't doing anything that really drove history forward. What drove history forward were great men who did great things. And Aquaman understands that perfectly. History is the contest of great men doing great things. And when two equally great men who want to do different things have a disagreement, that is when conflict occurs. Both hero and villain in this movie are manly and brave. Aquaman more so than Orm. However, still, Orm is no coward. He's just deeply misguided for reasons that we'll get into. And this contest between the two half-brothers was over the exact right things. The things that wars should be fought over. This is basically just a list of the reasons why one should be willing to fight in a just war. Tradition, legitimacy, which of course only applies to the period when we have monarchs. It doesn't really apply as much now. Strength, and morality. Those are the things that they fought over, and as you might guess, Aquaman won. But before we get to the point where he won, we still have other things we need to get to. One of the things that's really fascinating about Aquaman is that the villain, King Orm, is both brave and strong and a man. However, he is evil. And his evil is a very specific kind of evil, which makes him especially villainous and scary. He is a misguided leftist who has a fundamental misunderstanding of both geopolitics and the traditions of his own kingdom. Now, Orm is someone who relies on the support of the establishment in his Atlantean kingdom. He relies on the support of other aristocrats and of other kings, like the king played by Dolph Lundgren. What Orm wants to do is unite all of the states of Atlantis against their will, so he is the personification of big government, and make war on the surface over a fake threat of pollution and global warming. Now, you could argue that he was simply power hungry, which is usually what drives leftists to be into environmentalism, but actually I think that he genuinely believed it, and the reason I think that he was genuine is because he later was willing to deal with Arthur and listen to their mother. Orm is a great leftist villain, and I think that he was inspired by the great leftist villains of history like Stalin and Hitler. So that is part of why I think that he resonates so strongly, and why I believe that if there is some sort of award that goes out to the best villain of a movie in 2018, that Orm has to be the runaway favorite, because not only was he truly remarkably evil and dangerous, but he was also extraordinarily realistic. And once again, just like everything else in Aquaman, everything that happens here is informed by a deep and accurate understanding of history. Only 15 years separated the two greatest events in Western and human history. In 1776, America had its revolution, and we set up a constitution to be our new king, with liberty and justice for all. In 1789 in France, however, they overthrew both the nobility and the monarchy, and then instituted absolute mob rule and chaos. And Western civilization has been on a moral decline ever since. What Aquaman does above all else is reverse engineer the French Revolution. The French Revolution was about anarchy and radical equality that is contrary to nature, but Aquaman is all about hierarchy, which is the real first principle of Western civilization. In the movie, only important people are given major roles and are enabled to exercise power. In other words, only people who matter should matter. This is not a crazy thought. This is the thought of the people who built Western civilization, from Alexander, the great conqueror of the Orientals, to Charlemagne, to King Arthur. All of the great figures of Western civilization have understood this. Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, etc., etc. The idea of commoners or bureaucrats regulating royals and nobles is an insult to nature, just like the idea of bureaucrats and regulators trying to tell the elite who drive the capitalist system what to do is an insult to nature and a complete reversal of how things should work. It's a perversion. It is immoral. Anyway, what Aquaman does is it shows exactly how these kind of disputes should be settled. When two great men have a conflict, there shouldn't be an arbiter, which is just some loser bureaucrat with an off-the-rack suit. It should be another great man who's even greater than the great men involved. That is how the world works. Or should work, at least. Anyway, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, and I highly recommend that you go see Aquaman once again, and really appreciate it for the conservative Republican masterpiece that it is. I would say it is definitely the best movie of 2018, and it has already entered into my all-time top 5 movies. So, without any further ado, I bid you adieu, and I order you all to go home and be good conservative Republicans.